a large chunk of the time, the challenges and the frustrations and the stresses, if you start to kind of unpack it a little bit more, a lot of the time it comes back to a self-leadership issue, and it comes back to some type of negative emotion that is driving us.
Welcome to Divine Renovation's Missional Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, Tammy LeBlanc.
Hey, Matt. Hey, Rob. Always good to see you guys again. I think our listeners may not appreciate that even though we've worked together for years, we're not actually physically located together in an office space. And in Matt's case, he's not even in the same country as us. We're getting kind of used to seeing each other on screen, but nonetheless, always a pleasure to see you.
Well, Tammy, it is good to be seen. I was reflecting on this, though. We've only met in person like once, and it was in Montreal. And that was this year. So we've worked together for several years and just meeting online. This is like, we used to make fun of people for meeting on the internet and like, oh my gosh, that's so dangerous. And now I work with a bunch of people who I met on the internet. Ironically, when I first started in the ministry, though, I was the first U.S. employee.
Yeah.
So I know we had Hannah over in the U.K., but I was the first U.S. employee. And I wasn't just in the U.S. I wasn't like along the Canadian-U.S. border. I'm buried down here in Texas. So if I didn't have Zoom, I'd never get to see y'all.
Yeah, I remember trying to figure out what does it look like to hire our first employee in the United States, right? There were so many logistics to even figure out what we needed to do to make that happen, how far we've come. And yeah, 4 years, Matt, you and I worked together before we actually met in person. Crazy.
Well, and it was weird too, because Matt, you and I had met before you started coaching Divine Renewal. So we actually met in person before, but we still went a long time after we became colleagues before we actually connected in person as well.
How the world's changed. Yeah. Now I see more of you than I do my children.
Okay, so guys, let's dive into today's conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about self-leadership. We talk about leadership all the time, but I feel like we talk about it more in the context sometimes of leadership teams. So today we're going to kind of address self-leadership a bit more. I'm kind of compassionate to those priests that veer away from renewal because they themselves don't see themselves as a leader. Somewhere in their lives, they've kind of come up with a definition themselves of what they think a leader is. And for whatever reasons, they've decided they don't fit that definition. And I know you guys work really hard to help them see themselves as a leader. But more specifically in this topic of self-leadership, we're going to take a look at self-awareness. So when we talk about self-awareness, I think we're talking about being aware of their emotional world, right? And being aware of their strengths, being aware of their weaknesses, and even being aware of their blind spots. So is that kind of a fair assessment of self-leadership in terms of emotional awareness?
I'd like to jump in too, because I know Rob, I feel like, is kind of the self-leadership guru and will have a whole lot to say about this. So maybe if I'm going to weigh in at all, now's the time. Like, I got to pick my battles. But I do think one thing that's just to get clear around this idea of self-leadership too, that it can be a little bit of a misnomer, right? Like, self-leadership doesn't mean you do it alone. Self-leadership also does not mean that you have to teach yourself these. Like, you got to go at it yourself. Like, you have to do all the learning. You have to discover it and you have to implement it yourself. So going at it alone or figuring it out on your own are not part of self-leadership. Actually, we're going to see, I think, as Rob talks more about it too, how self-leadership and team leadership, although they're kind of two sides of the same coin, they really can't be disconnected from each other. And the final thing, I think, is we've set up a structure in some of our churches where we're expecting the leader to do it alone. Mm-hmm. And we don't know how to support that or challenge that, because it seems like unless the leader wants to lead differently, there's not a lot we can do about that. So this is really about exploring for the leader the possibility of there being another way that's easier, that's more effective, that demands less of his just time, energy, and resources to do it all. It's about spreading it out, doing what you're good at, and like all the things you said, Tammy, about blind spots and strengths and weaknesses. So just want to kind of set the stage that self-leadership can need to almost be demystified a little bit too before we dive in.
Sure, good point.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Max. It's a really good distinction. it doesn't maybe seem obvious, but yeah, if you want to be really good at team leadership, you have to be good at self-leadership as part of that. And, one feeds the other to try to help kind of become a healthy leader and to lead from a healthy perspective, for sure. So yeah, no. As you unpack the idea of self-leadership, there's a few different dimensions, I'd highlight. First is you have to lead yourself first before you can lead anyone else if you want to lead, effectively. And I think also, partly in the context of, what we're doing with parish renewal is so often, priests will look at their, their parishes and their churches and all that's going on and see the problem outside of themselves and recognize that ultimately before you change your circumstances, before you change, your parishes, before you lead towards renewal, you've got to really step in and change yourself first. And to the point that's already been made is so often we do tend to come at these things with a very narrow sense of understanding around leadership. And we have, what historically gets called the great man theory of leadership, where you're this strong type A personality that is very decisive and can step into complex situations and make decisions and make hard choices and charismatic and win everybody over to your way of understanding things. And you just kind of, you step in and lead and save the day, right? And, every hero movie kind of reinforces that some way or another. And there are some leaders that have very, kind of type A personality parts to them. But the question that we ask so often in coaching isn't, are you a leader or not? The question is, what type of a leader are you? Right? And leadership comes in so many different styles and approaches and strengths and abilities. And so when you come into this, it's not am I a leader or not? No, it's what type of leader are you? And that requires, self-leadership. Even on this call, most of us on this call have a pretty good understanding of each other's strengths and abilities. And, Matt, you've got amazing skills to kind of step in front of a stage and, lead people. And you do an amazing job speaking to large groups of people. And you've got a very decisive mind. And when we're in meetings, you're always bringing us back to what's the vision? Why are we doing this? And you've got that certain wiring about you. And, Tammy, you're very much wired around execution and next steps, and you call us back to actions, things like that, right? And so we all exhibit leadership through a different context. That's kind of the beginning point of self-leadership is I kind of know what I bring to the table, but I also know what I don't bring to the table as well.
Rob, the part about what you don't bring to the table is just as important, isn't it? Otherwise, you don't know the difference. If you don't know the difference between a strength and a weakness, it means you don't know that you have any weaknesses. You might think you're good at everything. Yeah. And one thing, here's an interesting thing to think about. When we think about blind spots, they're blind spots because I can't see them. They're weaknesses because I don't possess them.
Yeah.
Which comes back to team leadership at some level too. Someone has to help me see the blind spot or possess the strength for a weakness that I don't have. Otherwise, we're right back into that misnomer of self-leadership, which I have to figure out how to be good at every blind spot and not have any, and I have to be good at everything and not have any weaknesses. And both of those are impossible for one person to do. So self-leadership does have this level of humility going into it first too, doesn't it? I mean, Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. So if you need a book starting point or anything John Maxwell wrote on leadership, I think those are good starting points on leadership. But Jim Collins mentions in his book, Good to Great, his reflection on what made these companies great. The first indicator was the leader. And it isn't the leader that you just defined, the charismatic, has an answer for everything type A. Those can get results for a time. But the sustainability, if we're going for in leadership, has some other qualities that might either escape some of those natural leaders or those natural leaders have figured out how to possess as well. And humility is a big, big trait in self-leadership.
So I'm curious, guys, because I know I've heard you speak about priests coming in and working with a leadership team and almost steamrolling them, not realizing the impact that they're having. So how, through coaching, do you help them to identify their blind spots?
Yeah, there's a few different ways that we approach it. One is we use some basic measurement tools or psychometrics that help give us direct feedback. We use a tool from Gallup called Strength Finder, and that measures a number of different strengths, and it gives you, depending on, there's a couple of different ways. The basic one gives you what your top 5 strengths are, and you can unpack all of the 34 strengths, and you can see what your bottom ones are. We work with another tool called APEST, which comes out of Ephesians 4, and that's an acronym for Apostle, Prophet, Evangelist, Shepherd, Teacher, which kind of speaks a little bit more to your motivation around what kind of drives you. But beyond that, part of what we do is we always we require every pastor to lead out of a team. And there's a lot more on that. But one of the basic elements of that is that they're willing to step into places and have honest conversations. They're willing to have, crucial conversations, and they're willing to, challenge each other, and they're willing to give each other honest feedback around that. And we always speak specifically into the reality of the priest, right? Because clericalism is a big thing, and they kind of set the tone. And so we recognize that the priest has a role in creating an environment where it's safe to be honest and speak around some of these issues and to receive feedback from their team.
So, Rob, are you helping guide what those conversations look like during the coaching sessions?
Yeah, I mean, it starts off fairly generally around, so if you go back to strengths, like, okay, so based on this, do you see these strengths, and do you see these strengths in yourself, Father? And then if you're taking the team through Strength Finder, do you see how these strengths work with your team as well? And then do you see the strengths that you don't have? You started at a very safe kind of generic level, kind of at that. But then as you're getting into, forming a team, then you're starting to ask the questions, okay, how open are you to feedback? How much feedback do you get? And one of the things when I'm talking to a priest, and a lot of times, and again, it doesn't always play out this way, but a lot of times they will have formed a senior leadership team, but in a one-on-one meeting, I'll always ask them, tell me about your team. Tell me why you selected the different people that you did. And most of the time when the priest is aware of this, or when the priest is in a healthy place, they'll go through and they'll talk about the different team members. And there will be one or two, and they'll say, they don't mind being honest with me, or they will challenge me, or they're not scared to speak up, right? And so you start to get a sense of just that awareness and that openness to them. Other times they'll go through and they'll talk about their strengths or their abilities, and then you'll ask and say, so I'd love to know, out of all the team members, how many of them are willing to be honest with you and challenge you and have direct conversations with you? And sometimes, if you see the, deer in the headlights, like, so, then you just start to kind of unpack that with them a little bit more and say, this is something that you may want to watch for. This is something that I'd encourage you to be open to. And so that can happen on the front end. Further down, as you get into coaching, sometimes if you're having a session with the senior leadership or the leadership team themselves, you'll ask them, sometimes a question, and you'll have them kind of go around and say, I'd love to know on a scale of 1 to 10, how honest are each of you in your conversations and discussions with each other? And you kind of go around and, you'll hear, well, I'm a 5 out of 10, I'm a 6 out of 10. And if everybody is like, okay, so then maybe this is an issue that we should start to talk through. Or sometimes you'll do that and you'll have a couple of members, I'm a 5 out of 10, but then you'll have one or two that, no, I'm an 8 out of 10, I'm a 9 out of 10, I don't hold anything back. And so you just start to get a sense for it that way. And so you're always trying to judge and kind of sense what the environment is like with the different churches that you're working with.
Such revealing truths to be found in those conversations, I imagine. Is that your experience too, Matt?
It really is, and then every time you add like a new member to a team, I mean, here we are kind of talking about teams and self-leadership. You have to start over, because what you have to do with each person is develop their self-leadership. So it starts with an awareness, right? They need to know who they are, the gifts they possess, the weaknesses that they also possess, and how that's going to come to bear on the team. And a lot of people think, first of all, like, my weaknesses are going to give me away. I'm going to be seen as a fraud, instead of what their gifts will actually do to the team. So sometimes it's not humility maybe that we struggle with. It's actually giving ourselves permission to celebrate the things we're good at. Because that's kind of a false humility if it's painted that way. Yeah. We need people to know what they're really good at. And people know that. They just don't want to share it. They're like, well, I don't want to brag, or people are going to now hate me if I say I'm good at something. But what you start to notice, if everybody's practicing self-leadership, then it's embraced as a team. And people can talk about what they're good at without someone else being insecure that they don't possess that. Because the other thing they're aware of is someone else has the gifts that they don't have. I was coaching a new parish leader this week over their StrengthsFinder results. And she brought her results with me, and we were looking over them, and I was asking what was revealing to her and what was surprising. She was like really excited because it gave language to her strengths. That's why I like the tool so much, because it named the things in a real clear way that she was good at. I said, well, did you look at the bottom ones? And she said, no, I didn't even look at those. I'm like, okay, I want to know what you think of those. And she's like, oh, those, I'm surprised to see this one down there. I wish it was higher. And I said, so tell me what you do. She goes, well, I probably should focus on fixing those. I said, see, no, that's the tendency, right? Is we go straight to the things we're not so good at, and we want to fix them. Because working on your weaknesses isn't just try harder or be better. That's almost impossible to do very effectively for very long. You can't sustain that. But instead, if we are aware of our weaknesses, I can then say, hey, guess what? I got Rob on my team. He's really darn good at these things, and I'm not good at those. I'm going to stop pretending. I'm going to let Rob be good at those things, and I'm going to be good at the things Matt's good at. It's almost like liberating, like this weight's been lifted off your shoulder because you're not having to pretend you're someone else. You're not having to perform for anyone else, and you're living how God actually built you on that team.
Yeah.
And one other thing I'll say real quick before I jump in, and I was with another team, and they had all done APEST, the other indicator you talked about, Rob. And then the lady that was like collecting these at the parish said, please don't share these with anyone on our team. We don't want everyone else to know what our strengths are. I was like, where did they miss the memo that this is about how to make us all better at leading a parish? She was hoping, well, I'll just give myself a little insight about myself and I'll go back about my business doing my little ministry here. After the event was over, she said, oh, now I see. This is making us a better team. And so light bulbs were going off, and that was really fun to see in coaching session.
Yeah. And again, this is where the self-leadership piece and the team piece come in. We're talking a lot about team, but hopefully we're showing how the self-leadership plays into it, because, in order to lead well, you've got to have other people around you, because we always speak into the fact that there's no such thing as a well-rounded leader, but there can be a well-rounded team. And the collective of a high-performing team will always outperform in every organization. You can go back and look at all kinds of social science around that. But at the foundation of that is the idea that a high level of trust exists amongst the team, right? Well, if a member of the team has a lot of blind spots and there's things that they're good at that they're really not, or they don't understand how they're good, right? Like that is always going to undermine that trust, which is going to undermine, the performance of the team. And so when you can say, hey, right now we're up against this issue, and Tammy, you've got strong execution strength. So like, help me understand what needs to happen in this, or Matt, you've got a lot of influencing strengths. We're just not getting across to people. It's not even knowing what you do well. It's knowing really how you can step in and function together as a team. And also in those times, recognizing I don't bring these strengths. Like right now, I've got some opinions on this, and I'm always willing to give my opinions, but my strengths probably aren't what we need at this particular time, around what it is that we're working through. And to have that level of self-awareness, that's when you really start to see your team become effective. But that's kind of that crossover point of where, if you don't have that self-awareness, if you're not offering that self-leadership, then that's just going to undermine your team performance and what you accomplish as a team as well.
Yeah, I like this idea of loving people for who they are and not what they're not. Really leaning into and appreciating the gifts that God's given them, and accepting that just because they're weak in certain strengths doesn't make them less of a person. It's just God has gifted us in this way, and this is what we bring to the table. And you guys both pointed out, it's not that we can't live in those spaces, but those aren't our strong suits. So it takes more energy for us.
One of the things that I love to say as I begin a relationship with priests is, I want to help you be more of who God's made you to be. Because, right, so many of the priests come in and, they're working tireless hours. They're doing all kinds of stuff that's just sucking the life out of them. They're tired, and a lot of times they come into coaching a little bit skeptical, like, I don't know how I'm going to do all the things that you guys at Divine Renovation tell us to do, right? And in a lot of ways, I mean, we do speak into some things, but we're really trying to take stuff off of their plate. We're trying to make leadership easier, and to help people understand who they are a little bit more of, how God has created them to be. And they don't have to, every priest doesn't have to fit into this priestly mold that maybe they were taught in seminary, or maybe they just acquired somewhere else by just observing how other priests functioned. But no, they can be who they are. And the times when priests get that, like, it's just, you see that after they work past the skepticism and you convince them of it, you just see the freedom come on them. And that's one of the coolest things that we get to do as coaches is help people grow in that area and to kind of work through those fears and those challenges.
Yeah, Rob, I know you've challenged me a lot, even just in the way you think about self-leadership and share it with others. And one thing I've kind of learned through this is how priests and leaders are often set up where they're not in charge of their lives or their schedules. At least they don't feel like they are. So their schedules are not set up to say that they're in charge of it. And I don't just mean where like a parish priest has a secretary that helps them use their calendar, because that can be a helpful like freedom for a leader, is to have someone else help them manage that. But one of the things is they're doing all the things because someone else told them they're supposed to, someone else told them they have to, someone else expects them to, and they've never challenged any of that. So many leaders show up like as a parish priest, they're leading a parish, they've been handed the keys by the previous guy who did it this way, and they're like, well, I guess this is the way I'm supposed to do it and what's expected of me. And that's not self-leadership, that's letting someone else lead you. And so, yes, this is not baby with the bathwater out, right? There are things they got to do. Like, you should probably stick to the mass schedule. You should probably still, meet with people in crisis. That stuff needs to happen.
Yep.
But how do you build out not just what your schedules could look like, but you've got to build this out in the community. You all almost sometimes have to shift this for the community, what they expect you to be, what they're going to see you prioritize, how they're going to see you putting up boundaries around your days off, around like raising up other leaders to have some of the meetings that maybe you were expected to have, and it's okay for them to meet in your place, around some of the decisions that get made, that you don't have to be the one that has the clearinghouse for every decision. My favorite was when a coworker walked into my pastor's office. My pastor had been there about 2 weeks, and she said, okay, it's Advent. Do you like this color purple or this color purple? And I know what I was about to say, but you'd have to edit that out of this video. But he said, this is so good. He said, what do you think? I turned to him like, really? You're going to have a conversation? Just tell her and go. But it was such a crafty response. What do you think?
Yeah.
Because now she got to decide. And the next time she had a color paper choice, she didn't come back to his office. That was a sign of good self-leadership for me, to watch him put up a boundary and empower someone else to do it, training people in a new way of leading.
Yeah. And this is, kind of what you're explaining with a little bit of that, is where a little part of self-awareness and self-leadership is recognizing your kind of internal emotional world, right? And because again, the unwritten job description a lot of times for priests and church leaders is make everybody happy.
Ooh.
And
good luck with that ever.
Yeah. Like how often is it like a priest would go to a new parish and they'd been there a few weeks or a few months, and everybody says, so how's Father so-and-so doing? And the reaction is, well, good. People seem to like him. Right. And
Yeah.
like that's the whole. And again, obviously, you've got to go in and build relationships and healthy relationships and all this sort of stuff. And so you don't want to go in and just make everybody hate you. But at the same time, just functioning in a way where it's the perceptions of other people all the time and people pleasing and all that sort of stuff. And then once you start to go on mission, right? Like this is where your internal world and recognize what's going on emotionally really matters, and not allowing sometimes your negative emotions to dictate and influence. Because a lot of parish renewal is wrestling with a lot of internal fears, a lot of internal, insecurities, doubts. Before we always had, when we said at the beginning, kind of the quote unquote great man theory is you always have all the answers. Well, there's a lot of times you don't have the answers, and internally you just feel with this fear. And so learning to just own your internal world and recognize that your emotions are a part of who you are, but also learning to not always depend on your emotions or fall back on them, and trust that your emotions lie to you, Yeah. That's a part of this that it is fearful. Like all of a sudden, as you're going to change things, people are going to be upset with you. As you're learning to say no and set boundaries, you are going to have to learn to say no to people that historically you've said yes to. And so that's a key piece of making sense of your internal world and navigating the emotions as you move forward and change. And that's the part when we speak of before you can get a new parish, you have to get a new priest. And that's some of the internal changes that leaders, and we're saying priests, it's true for all leaders. It tends to rest a little bit more on the shoulders of the priest sometimes, that it has to begin with the priest. And so recognizing all of those internal dynamics as you're making some of those changes, as you're setting some of those boundaries, is part of what moving forward in leadership looks like as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that our this discussion on being aware of your emotional world is kind of a great breakdown within self-leadership to kind of wrap up the discussion. But before we go there, I just want to make sure we're really clear on the difference between a blind spot and a weakness. Because I'm wondering, like, if I'm hearing it correctly, that a blind spot could actually be a weakness. It's just that until you're aware of what your weaknesses are, it's a blind spot. So are they actually two in the same thing?
It's a good question. I mean, I think obviously I haven't done, I would have liked to have looked that question up before you asked me, Tammy. So I'm not like for all time and eternity being memorialized here in my answer on the fly, but that's how we roll. So my response without further investigation is that they can be the same thing, but often a lot of times too, blind spots, we feel them before we see them. Like we have an emotional response to something. So like, let's say...
Exactly. And that's what I'm kind of getting at, because Rob's kind of moved on to the social awareness. I'm tying it back to, because I'm wondering, that's probably a blind spot for a lot of people.
Yes. And until you know, like, why was I so strong in that? Why did that offend me so much? Why was I so insecure over that? I think maybe the blind spot often is the way we felt it, and it's not named. And people are like, "Oop, not going there again, not going into that blind spot," right? As opposed to, hey, you know what? I'm not very deliberative. That's one of the 34 strengths. By the way, it's like at the bottom of my list. Not very deliberative. Are you deliberative, Tammy?
That's in my top 5. Yeah.
See, it's on my bottom. That's why it works so well. I'm not very deliberative, and that's going to cost me here, so I need to be aware of it. Right? Weaknesses, I think, are named, if we're honest.
Yeah, I've always thought of, weaknesses. It's a weakness because you're not good at it. It's a blind spot because you're not good at it and you don't know it. Right? That's kind of how I always differentiated between kind of a weakness and a blind spot, and those can kind of function in outward things, skills and abilities. We've all probably had to sit through an experience where someone thought they were a good singer and they really weren't. Matt, could you sing a tune for it? No, anyways, never mind.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We'll see you next week.
But then also, kind of our internal emotional world, we tend to not actually spend a lot of time kind of thinking through that and examining it. It just kind of, we have fears, we have insecurities, we have anxieties, and they just kind of live there, and we don't spend the time kind of being aware that they're there and naming them. They're just kind of part of who we are, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think they can function internally and externally, kind of to your point, Tammy.
Okay, so in a coaching environment, are you helping the priests yourself to help them get a stronger sense of their emotional world? Are you actually relying on team members to help step into this space? So for example, like, hey, I find that whenever I do this, you do that. Do you guys help people work through those?
Yeah, we can, for sure. I think one way is to start really building the trust with the pastors, that we're their advocate, we're their other teammate. It's like, as a coach, you've got one foot in the team and one foot out of the team, right? There's kind of a both. But we can offer a perspective to them where often the priest feels a little safer because we're not like one of their direct reports. We don't work for them. And so maybe sometimes it starts with, hey, let's set this up to what it can look like for us to explore your strengths and weaknesses, and then challenge that leader to step into that place in his team and say, now you've got to model that for your team. Because if you're not vulnerable in sharing what your strengths and weaknesses are with the team, if you haven't at first, as Rob said way back at the beginning of this, figured out how to lead yourself, you'll never lead others. So I was going to ask even Rob kind of around this, because this is a little nebulous, isn't it? A little hard to get our hands around. We talk about, like, we're not going to do a session today with a pastor maybe specifically on self-leadership. It just keeps manifesting itself, right? We keep speaking into it. So Rob, I don't want to say we need to demystify it now, but what are some like practical ways that we might want to see a pastor take a step or learn something beyond just taking an assessment? Is there other ways that they can become more self-aware and lead themselves? Put you on the spot now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say for me, to your point, I don't know if I ever have a coaching session where today we're going to talk through self-leadership, right? It emerges through the relationship, right? And, Matt, you have, it's all across the board. You have really high trust that kind of gets established really quickly sometimes in coaching relationships, and other times it takes a little bit of time. And then other times it's just kind of medium, so to speak, right? So it's all over the place. So to sometimes ask questions, like if they show up and there's problems and there's challenges and we have all kinds of conflict on their team or whatever, nothing seems to be going right. Just saying, so how are you personally dealing with that? Like, what's going on in your world right now? Like, are you fearful? Are you frustrated? Are you angry? Are you ready to quit? And so it's just, and again, it's at that point, the kind of the ball is in their court, and they can be as open and honest or as dishonest as they want to be around that point. So, so depending on where the relationship is, and a lot of times they're like, yeah, I'm really frustrated with this. I'm really angry at this, or I'm really fearful. I think this is going to blow up, or, stuff like that. And so, yeah, it's do you have the context of where those conversations can happen? Or sometimes, we'll be saying, yeah, this is happening on the team right now. It's like, okay, so how are you working through that as a team? And a pastor will say, yeah, like last week we didn't deal with any issues. We just talked about team dynamics, and they talked about talking through some of that stuff in the context of their teams, what they're working through that. So I guess that's kind of it's sort of a little bit more, for me anyways, more an organic part of how we kind of speak into things. And I always try to invite the conversation, and if I have high trust and I know the priest fairly well, I'll be like, okay, Father so-and-so, let's be honest here. And I'll challenge them to go a little bit deeper in some of those situations. And if I don't have that relationship, it's, not so much. So I guess that's a little bit of kind of how I approach it through those things.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's less of a topic or even a specific principle or practice, and it's a disposition. It's kind of an openness to it, right? The constant investment in self-leadership. It's not like we're going to tick that box. That's Canadian, isn't it? We're not going to check that box and just move on, right? We're going to constantly revisit that. That's like the page that's always there. So what's the challenge for you here? So how is that making you feel? So what's the next step for you? So what's getting in the way? All of those, even though they're getting at the heart of the issue, They're actually first having to go to the heart of the leader. And I think that's really where self-leadership has to live.
Yeah. Like one of the common challenges that we run into with priests is sometimes they fall into the habit of micromanagement. And 80% of the time, micromanagement is the result of fear. They're scared to trust others. They're scared others won't do it as well as them. People are going to let them down, all that sort of stuff, right? And so, but then it comes through it can come through all kinds of different lenses. Like, I'm so overworked. Okay, why are you overworked? Well, because I'm doing all this. Like, okay, so why aren't you giving some of those tasks away, or could you give some of those tasks away? Oh, right. And then eventually so it'll come through the conversations, right? And then as you're working through the problems and the challenges, you start to bury down. It's like, okay, so would you say that, or I might ask the question, would you say that at the end of the day, maybe there's people that you could trust, but you just don't trust them, right? And they're like, or sometimes they'll come to those conclusions themselves. Or other times they're so overburdened. Well, why are you overburdened? Well, I had this meeting yesterday, I had this, and then I had 4 people that wanted to come in because of marriage counseling issues. And it's like, okay, so why is your schedule overloaded like that? Let's get below that. And then it gets down to the idea that they don't want to say no to anybody, right? So, a large chunk of the time, the challenges and the frustrations and the stresses, if you start to kind of unpack it a little bit more, a lot of the time it comes back to a self-leadership issue, and it comes back to some type of negative emotion that is driving us. And so just kind of allowing the conversation to go where it'll go. And again, we try to have a bit of a non-directive asking questions approaches, but sometimes, particularly when trust is high, I'll sort of like, do you think it's and speak a little bit more directly into the situation, depending on who the priest is and the relationship is. And sometimes I'll do that and I get it completely wrong, or they, things like that. But it just makes for having some of those conversations to work through some of that stuff. So a lot of that in my mind is always, that's just trying to be aware of how that stuff shapes us and influences us.
So guys, I appreciate that in light of time, we're going to try and wrap up this conversation because I know there's lots to talk about under self-leadership. Is there any resources that you could give to the listeners as to how they can now go off on their own and grow in their self-awareness?
Yeah, I think we are starting to see a lot of different resources in this area. A couple that I just kind of point people to for those that are readers. The first is Henry Nouwen wrote a book on leadership called In the Name of Jesus, where he kind of wrestles through a lot of this stuff, as in his own sort of leadership. The other one is another book called The Emotionally Healthy Leader, which is written by a guy by the name of Peter Scazzaro, who was a pastor in New York City. So those would just be a couple of resources that I would throw out there for anybody that's kind of wanted to dive into this in a little bit more practical way on their own.
Yeah, I mentioned one earlier was Good to Great by Jim Collins. 5 Levels of Leadership, I think it's called, by John Maxwell. Talk about that self-leadership aspect in both of those books. I also like, although it starts to gravitate into teams, of course, because remember, self-leadership is valuable specifically in team leadership. You can't have one without the other. Patrick Lencioni wrote The Better Pastor, and it's a little fabled book. He writes in fables and then gives you the learnings throughout. And then it's not just for pastors, by the way. It could also be for team leaders, because it moves from how a pastor needs good team leaders around them, and it does start with self-leadership. And finally, I would just say maybe a practice that a priest could do is to start maybe meeting if you haven't done this yet with your team, start with one person and invite them in and say, hey, can we ask a few honest questions of each other? Where do you see as my strengths? Where do you see as my weaknesses? What do you see as my blind spots? Where have I let you down? And maybe we can go back and forth. If you frame the conversation up in a way that you're going to both be vulnerable, then you can set it. It's not situational, like, hey, I need to tell you about a time you let me down. You're giving space for it to process it together, so you can practice in that way, just seeing what it means to reflect back how you show up to other people.
Mm-hmm. Those are some great ideas. I always appreciate your guys' insights. I hope you, the listeners, have also appreciated some of the insights into coaching and perhaps growing in your own self-awareness. And we'd love to continue the conversation. If you have any thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. And as well, we will include the resources that Matt and Rob recommended in the show notes below. We'll see you next time.